Making an impact this week, Congressman Jared Moskowitz, his concern over FEMA's disaster fund ahead of hurricane season, his plan so they don't run out of funding. Plus, we break down Florida's new permitless carry law. Hear from former Miami Police Chief George Kalina and his concerns. This is NBC 6 Impact, and I'm your host, Jackie Nespral. Earlier this week, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down affirmative action in college admissions. I had the chance to talk to South Florida Congressman Jared Moskowitz about this decision, plus his efforts to raise the minimum age to buy a rifle and his plan to keep FEMA funded. Congressman, as always, thank you so much for joining us on NBC 6 Impact.
Thanks for having me, Jackie.
So I want to begin with the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action, rejecting that on college admissions. Your thoughts?
Well, first, let me say overall, in 1 year, we have seen both Roe v. Wade and affirmative action fall, two landmark cases, landmark laws in this country that people have grown up around. One, rights for women, other, making an equal playing field for African Americans and minorities in this country. And so, this latest decision by this activist court, it's funny, we always hear about activist judges. This is an activist decision in my mind, reversing years of precedent. And the idea now that, African American businesses, minority students, it's unclear now how colleges are going to respond. But obviously the whole idea was to increase diversity in this country and to level the playing field. And so, look, it's just another unfortunate decision from this court, and we'll have to figure out how we go forward.
We are in the midst of hurricane season, and I know that you introduced legislation to replenish FEMA's disaster relief fund before it's depleted. Is there a risk right now that that could happen before hurricane season ends?
100%. There's a significant risk. Thank you for bringing this up. So this is one of the first times ever that this has happened, where the disaster relief fund is going to run out of money in the middle of hurricane season. And look, there's a lot of reasons why that happened. Obviously, we've had major disasters. Hurricane Ian is going to cost FEMA $9 billion. The rainstorm in Fort Lauderdale is a $300 million event. Obviously, all the money spent from COVID and other disasters around the country. But this is something that we can't wait for a disaster where FEMA then doesn't have the money, and then we have to do a supplemental. So we're trying to be proactive, which is something that should happen more often in Congress rather than be reactive. And so I've asked for $11 billion in the House. That's the bill that I filed. I'm working with Senator Rubio and Senator Scott over in the Senate. It's a bipartisan bill to make sure that FEMA has the resources so that communities can respond and recover when disaster strikes.
Something that hurricanes also affect our property insurance, and as you know, this is crisis mode right now in the state of Florida. And you introduced legislation that will lower the cost of homeowners insurance for Floridians. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I mean, listen, the Florida legislature tried to deal with that last session. I don't know that bill has had any success, quite frankly. We see rates still starting to creep up. I view this as a national issue because it's not just a Florida issue. Right? Our hurricane exposure is no different than Mississippi or Louisiana or Texas or up and down the East Coast. And so I think that the U.S. government has to help states get involved and has to work with the insurance companies to make sure that, one day you're not paying $5,000 and then when it comes to renewal time, it's now $15,000. What I wanted to try to create at the federal level is a national catastrophic fund, an insurance fund to help amortize the cost of insurance around the country.
I want to move to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas because with the concealed carry law in effect now in the state of Florida, I know that you have introduced two pieces of legislation to deal with that. You also worked with Congressman Tony Gonzalez as part of a bipartisan school safety and security caucus. Where does all of that stand?
Yeah, well, look, for me, obviously, being from Parkland, graduating from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, working on the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School Safety Act, which raised the age to 21 to buy a gun in the state of Florida, 3-day waiting periods, red flag laws, mental health counselors in all our high schools, SROs in all of our schools, hundreds of millions of dollars for mental health across the state of Florida, major school safety changes, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School Safety Commission. We did it all in one bill And look, federal government is different. Congress works a lot slower. It's a lot more partisan. And so we have to piecemeal things. Obviously, they passed gun violence prevention in the last Congress at the federal level. It was the first piece of legislation in 30 years dealing with gun violence prevention at the federal level. Look, this is an issue that parents want us to work on. 80% of Americans support background checks. 80% of Americans support red flag laws. 80% of Americans support raising the age to buy a gun to 21, which is what we did here in Florida. We did that on a bipartisan basis. We did it with Republicans. The law is still there 5 years later, and it's still working. The red flag laws we put into place have been used over 9,000 times here in the state of Florida. And there are no marches in the street that were abridging people's Second Amendment rights because we are not. We didn't ban possession. We banned the sale. And so, look, I'm not naive. We're not going to stop all gun violence prevention, but we can mitigate it. We don't stop hurricanes, we mitigate against them. And so, look, this permitless carry bill that they passed, I called it political carry because, quite frankly, it was a solution in search of a problem. We had no issue here in the state of Florida that required it. The concealed weapons permits were working just fine. But now we'll have to see, this is one step backwards here since what happened in Parkland. We'll have to see how it affects. But, look, at the federal level, I filed several bills. I'm working on school safety as a separate issue because you can do gun violence prevention and you can do school safety. There's things you can do in both of those categories. For me, it's all of the above. There's not one thing we can do that will solve all the problems. We have to do all of it.
You have always been really good in reaching out to the other side in a bipartisan way to get things done, especially here in the state of Florida. Obviously, we are living in a very divided country right now, very partisan. You're in Washington now. President Trump was indicted and arraigned here in our own backyard at Miami Federal Courthouse, and yet his popularity is growing, and he's still the front runner for the Republican Party to be the nominee for president. Your thoughts on all of that?
Well, first, let me say, you're talking to a Democrat who put his partisan hat on the side for 2.5 years and worked in a Republican administration because his own community faced unbelievable disaster in the shooting in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And it was an opportunity to help people in their time of need and crisis, not knowing that I would get, a 1 in 100 year pandemic. But, look, we have to find ways to work together. You can't just discount half the country, right? Republicans can't just discount the Democrats, and the Democrats can't just discount the Republicans. We have to figure out how to work together. Sure, there are things we're never going to agree on, but we got to be able to compromise. President Trump, is not above the law. It's clear that these are serious allegations. You don't have to listen to me. You can listen to Bill Barr, his own attorney general, who said he's toast. You can listen to Chris Christie, who was on his transition team, also a former prosecutor, has said he's in big trouble. I mean, the idea that he's showing Iranian battle plans to people, he admits on tape that they were classified, that he didn't declassify them, that he's storing them in his bathroom as if he's going to shower with these documents. But look, he has indictment momentum. Every time he gets indicted, people rally around him. He's probably thinking, hey, 2 more indictments, I'll win Iowa. Look, he would bring back extreme policies. He would have a presidency of retribution. Who is that helping? I mean, it's easy to be a grievance party, but how are you going to help the American people? And how are you going to bring people together to do that? And so, look, the economy's getting better. Inflation is going down. The infrastructure bill that they passed, we're starting to see that money deployed in the community. So I think Joe Biden's going to be a lot stronger than people think.
What about Governor DeSantis? Because as you mentioned, you worked under his administration, and he is also a candidate for the Republican nomination.
Well, look, obviously, I don't know what's going on in that side of the campaign. Obviously, I didn't vote for Governor DeSantis the first time. I didn't vote for him the second time, and I won't be voting for him if he turns out to be the nominee. Obviously, we have different politics and policies that we believe in. But look, right now, that whole party is beholden to Donald Trump. I mean, if polling still matters, and maybe it doesn't because sometimes it's shown to be wrong, but if polling still matters, I mean, Donald Trump's numbers just continue to go up. But look, Ron DeSantis is right there. He's number 2. I want to get back to the business that the American people sent us to Congress, which is to work on Social Security and women's issues and gun violence prevention and healthcare and education, and working together to make sure we're still, the world's greatest superpower. And look, I'll work with anyone. I've proven that in the past to try to, make progress for the American people.
You were talking a little bit about foreign policy, and you were appointed to the House Oversight and Foreign Affairs Committee. So let's talk about China right now, because there are reports that they could be building a training facility or a spy center there in Cuba. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's extremely concerning. We don't need to get alarmist and all of a sudden think, we're back to where we were in the 60s. But I will say this. I will say that it's unacceptable. We shouldn't stand for it. We got to figure out how to deal with it. I took a congressional delegation trip with Speaker McCarthy. We went to 4 countries. We went to Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and Italy. And I will tell you, in every situation, every conversation we had with every prime minister, China came up every single time. The American people have to know that when we pull back, when we become isolationist, China is filling that void. They're filling that vacuum every single time with their checkbook out, trying to give these countries money, trying to give them certain sort of loans that they can then use those economic powers. And they're not creating any jobs in these countries because they're bringing Chinese labor into these countries to build these infrastructure projects. And so it's so important that we remain engaged around the world. Otherwise, if we're so concerned with China, which is why we created a China Select Committee, well, it's not just about domestic issues. If we retract from the world stage, then China is going to become our equal. And we have to prevent that, because China is not a stabilizing force, they're a destabilizing force.
Well, I mean, Cuba is 90 miles from the United States, so you think that this could be a potential threat to this country?
100%. What are they doing there? I mean, they're only there because they're mad that we're in the China Sea, which they claim is theirs and we say is international water, right? They're only there because we're, sticking by Taiwan, which they want to take. They're watching what's happening in Ukraine right now with a magnifying glass, because they know if Russia winds up with any piece of Ukraine, if that's how this settles, if Russia gets a piece of Ukraine, that's a lesson for China and Taiwan.
Congressman, as always, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Jackie.